Okay, welcome everyone. This roundtable on digital labor history and labor studies organized by the Nordic Labor History Network. We have almost 90 minutes to discuss how the digital turn affects labor history and labor studies. I'm Sami Suodejoki from Tampere University. I'm glad to have the chance to chair this session. I myself have been teaching digital history courses at my university in recent years. I've used some simple computational tools in my own research, but I don't feel like an expert in this field. Luckily, I'm only the chair, and we have an excellent group of discussants. First, we have Eric Blanc, who I suppose has just woken up in the US, and Eric has earlier worked on his PhD thesis at New York University, but I suppose he has now moved or is moving on to work at Rutgers University. You can tell more about that yourself. Eric is specialized in strikes and new workplace organizing in the 21st century US. He has written the book Red State Revolt, the Teachers' Strike Wave and Working Class Politics, and that teacher strike is a topical issue here in Finland now, as the teachers are went to strike this morning, which affects many of us. It would be interesting to hear Eric's thoughts about this, but this is not our topic today. I should also mention that Eric has also contributed to the history of the Finnish labor movement, because Finland is one important case in his study titled Revolutionary Social Democracy, Working Class Politics Across the Russian Empire, 1882-1917, which was published by Brill last year. So he's both a historian and sociologist. Then to our second discussant, Jenny Jansson, who is a senior lecturer at the Department of Government at Uppsala University. She has studied trade union movement, and as I understood, you are leading a project on state labor relations in India and Ethiopia currently. One of her earlier projects was titled Labor Gone Digital, which aimed at creating digital tools for collecting and storing the materials of the Swedish labor movement. And perhaps we hear some outcomes of this project today as well. And finally, we have Risto Turunen, who's currently working as a postdoc researcher at the University of Warsaw, but who defended his PhD thesis last year at Tampere University. Risto's thesis is titled Shades of Red, Evolution of the Political Language of Finnish Socialism from the 19th century until the Civil War of 1918. And it's definitely a pioneering work in the field of digital history in Finland. And Risto has also been involved in many other digital humanities projects lately, so I'm sure he has many ideas to share with us. Maybe we can start the first round now by letting the discussants tell briefly about themselves and their research. And as you speak, maybe you can also give one concrete example of how the so-called digital turn in the broad understanding of the concept has transformed your research or added value to it. So this would be the first question, and then for the second and third rounds, I have some other questions to all the discussants. And people in the audience, you can also participate by writing questions or comments to the chat. And if possible, the discussants can respond to these comments as they speak, but we also spare some 20 minutes of this at the end of this session for a joint discussion where everyone can pose questions. So, but let's start with this first round. Maybe, well, Risto, you can start, and then Jenny, and then Eric. Okay.
Okay, thank you for the introduction, Sami, and hello, everybody. So my name is Risto, and I prepared for this roundtable by getting the haircut, of course, but then I also wrote this book that Sami mentioned, Shades of Red, it's freely available online. Maybe I can send the link in the chat later. But of course, the long answer to your question, how has this digital turn affected my research, can be found in this book. But if I answer it very shortly, I have maybe two keywords to give you. So the first one is scaling up my research, and the second one is a new context. And if I may briefly explain what I mean, well, in my thesis, I studied both computationally and manually, both handwritten and printed newspapers, in order to make a strong contribution to this classical topic of Finnish historiography, that is the rise of socialism. So in the beginning of this journey, I only used handwritten newspapers. But then when I learned that, okay, all the printed newspapers are available as a machine readable data set, then I realized that, yes, I want to integrate this fantastic data set into my own research design. So of course, with close reading methods, I could not read that many newspapers during one PhD project, or even during one lifetime. So because we don't live forever, 100 years maybe at maximum. I come from the northeast Finland, so that's a lot shorter lifespan expected. So, but using these kind of computational methods, I could read a larger part of the public discourses in the early 20th century. So I had 500 newspapers, which I read from start to the end, but then I also had I had 4 major printed labor newspapers that contained like 200 million words. So I read them with the help of computer. So computer identified patterns in these newspapers, and then I could close read. Okay, what happens here? This word is speaking in the revolutionary year of 1917. Why this word is speaking? Then I go to the original sources and check it. That was the scaling up part. Then this second answer is connected to the first one. So a new context. Some old school historians say that this digital history means an act of decontextualization or something like this. I've heard the slogan that you cannot Google context. Well, you can actually Google context. And if you Google it, it means something like context is a relation between the object of your interest and what you construct around it. So for me, when I was, for example, reading these handwritten newspapers in the context of the printed labor press, I realized that many of these handwritten newspapers have been entirely or partly stolen from the printed labor press. And with the help of this finding, I could challenge one earlier interpretation of Finnish socialism, which claimed that these handwritten newspapers, they rise from some kind of authentic collective soul of the proletariat. So that's one example. Yeah.
Okay, Jenny.
Okay, so well, thank you for inviting me to this roundtable. As Sami said in the presentation, I'm at Uppsala University and I'm a political scientist. So my interest lies mostly in the contemporary trade union movement, but I have done research on labor history as well. My dissertation was on the 1920s in Sweden, 1930s, but recently most of my projects have been about the contemporary labor movement. And I'm guessing the reason I was invited is also that I was the project leader of the project Digital, Labor Gone Digital, as Sami mentioned. And in this project, we tried, or we sort of also succeeded, partly at least, to build an archive for Swedish trade unions for material that has been generated or born online. Because a lot of things happen online today. With the event of social media, mobilization takes place on social media and online. And this is a material which is very rarely systematically preserved for future historians. And this is going to be a problem for historians sometimes in the future, but it's currently a problem for political scientists or social scientists, I guess. So, and we discovered this when we were collecting material for a protest database. And we applied for funding, and we got this funding to build the e-archive, which was a collaboration with the Labour Movement's archive in Stockholm. Archive and Library is the correct name, actually. And they are right now handling the software that we built for collecting web pages. So for me, digital labor has been, or the digital turn, of course, has been that there are new ways of mobilizing, which has been really interesting to examine and do research on. We wrote one book on YouTube, trade unions on YouTube. So that's the social media that we have studied in particular as a result of this the project. But so how has the digital turn transformed or added value to my research? Well, one part is, of course, that there are new ways of mobilizing, new things to examine, actually. But if I look back at my PhD and what I did in my historical research, I would say that, well, one part is, of course, the collection of digitized material, which is easy to access. That's one part, but also the software revolution. So you go to an archive, you take pictures of documents that you want to analyze, and you put it into a program, and the program can just convert it into text. Or you can code it very easily and sort of organize all the documents that you collect. And I imagine that 20, 30 years ago, this would have taken a lot more time than it does today, when you can easily sort of sort a very big, large material. So I think these are two things that have been really important to me in my work.
Okay, thank you, Eric.
Yeah, thanks for having me on the panel. It's great to be able to discuss this with you all. My background, as was mentioned, was in history. So I wrote a big, long book about Marxist movements in the borderlands of the former Tsarist Empire. But my current research is overwhelmingly focused on current labor organizing, particularly in the public sector. And so for that, I found digital data and techniques to be invaluable. To give just a little bit of background, as was mentioned earlier, I wrote a book on the big strike wave in the United States of teachers in 2018. And that was primarily based on ethnographic research and interviews. And as I've been working on my dissertation and a forthcoming book on this, I've started to tap the database that I collected through these viral Facebook groups that really were the hub of the strikes. And so there was the biggest strike wave in education in US history. We're talking hundreds of thousands of workers. And maybe you all don't know, but these were organized and initiated to a significant extent over Facebook groups, which is, this in itself is a novel phenomena, which is just worth thinking through how forms of trade union mobilization and work stoppages are distinct than they were in the past, but it also is just an opportunity because it's an amazing data set. I was able to download the entirety of the Facebook groups. And so we're talking millions of words, almost maybe I think 500,000 different posts and comments just for a few month period. So you have in this data set basically a pretty unique vantage point in how the consciousness of strikers changed, hour by hour, minute by minute. That's what I've tried to do with my dissertation, and I have some published articles on this already. If you look at Politics and Society, I think it's called Digitized Labor Strategy. The questions I'm asking is basically, what can we learn about worker mobilization that we couldn't before, just for the absence of data and sort of rigorous techniques for aggregating and analyzing large data sentiment? Because before, you could you could maybe do a poll of, you could potentially like do a survey of workers at the end of a strike. You could look at how workers vote on a contract, but there's just literally no way to have this level of granular detail hour by hour, minute by minute, of what strikers were talking about, what what their concerns were, how their opinions changed. And so for me, the big value added of digital labor studies is on the one hand, this is new data. This isn't just a different form of things we used to have in the past. So, but this is actually a new window into looking at how workers in motion think about their actions and how they discuss. And you can ask all sorts of questions about that. The particular thing I'm focused on now, just to give you a sense of, is trying to map the relationship between expectations and perceptions of outcomes. Most of the time when you look at labor strikes, we think at, just what was won in the contract, pay or better working conditions, things like this. But how do we assess whether workers actually think that they've won? This is the question I'm asking, because sometimes you can win a lot, but if your expectations are even higher, then it feels like a loss. And so this is the puzzle sort of empirically in these strikes, is that some of the strikes that won the least were perceived to be the most successful, and some of the ones that won the most were perceived to be defeats. And I'm leveraging topic modeling specifically and sentiment analysis. And so we can dive into that maybe a little bit later, but topic models to track what people were talking about, sentiment analysis to track how they felt about those topics, to basically show that there was a discrepancy between high expectations and outcomes. And then you can look at the relative discrepancy between expectations and perceived outcomes to explain the puzzle of why some places that won less were felt to be bigger victories. So that's a bit what my research is on, and looking forward to digging into it more with the rest of you.
Okay, thank you. Excellent. Now let's move on to discuss the second issue, on which I have a question. Based on your experience, what are currently the biggest bottlenecks of better labor history or labor studies from the digital perspective? These bottlenecks could relate to the lack of machine-readable sources, bad quality of digitalization projects, computational skills among historians, or whatever. Do you have what are your views on this? Maybe if Jenny, if you like to start.
Sorry. Yeah, sure. I mean, of course, it would be good if everything was digitized, that it would be easy to do research. But I think it's a more urgent problem is the material that is generated online and not archived, actually. I think we should really focus our resources on trying to build smart solutions for archiving things that happens on the internet. But when it comes to bottlenecks, I mean, my own experience is that copyright legislation can be really tricky and also prevent access to good material. So for instance, the digitized newspaper database in Sweden, which is based in the Royal Library, you can only access it from the Royal Library, from specific computers. And this is due to copyright reasons, at least this is what they tell us. I think if it would have been open, a lot more people would use this as a source. And also it would be really good for the public if it was open for anyone to access. I think copyright legislation is not really adjusted to the digitalized world yet. And I mean, you need to think about, is it reasonable that you have 70 years of copyright on newspaper articles? Maybe it should be a shorter time period. I can respect copyright, but maybe not 70 years. I mean, this is really up for discussion, of course. We also encountered a lot of problems with copyright when we built the archive for the trade unions, especially pictures published on web pages. If the unions didn't themselves have the copyright on the pictures, it became really tricky to sort of handle them. It was okay to download it, but once the archive then shows these images or pictures for visitors, it's officially being republished, and that can be a violation of the copyright of the picture. So the pictures turn out to be really hard due to copyright issues. I think this is one major issue and problem for more efficient digital labor history or research in general, I think. I'll
Yes.
stop there.
Yes, thanks. Excellent point. Eric, what's your view on this?
Well, a few things. One is I got spoiled with this data set, these Facebook groups, and which is to say that it's not always the case for mobilized workers or workers in general that you have relatively representative data sets. And so this is a big problem, I think, with digital labor and sort of digital research generally, is oftentimes researchers just rely on what data is there. And so insofar as people are looking at trying to look beyond just what organizations are saying and to try to get some read on what workers are saying, the thing that's most available, for instance, is Twitter in the United States and elsewhere. Just the API gives the access to Twitter data. But sort of the nature of Twitter, both who's on it and then the types of conversations, which tends to not really be kind of deliberative. You don't have the collective deliberation of a closed Facebook group, means that the types of questions that I was able to ask in looking at these Facebook groups, it's hard to get a comparative read on how this might play out in other strikes, just for the absence of comparable data sets. One of the phenomena that is happening more and more is workers are using WhatsApp groups to organize strikes and to sort of organize internally. But again, these tend to be fragmented. It tends not to be one big group. And then so it becomes harder to track down this data. It's possible, like if you know somebody who's in the group, they can download it for you, but you don't get the same sort of macro ability to analyze a mobilization, just because there's usually limits on how many people can be in these groups. So if in Brazil, for instance, there was a mass truckers strike just a couple of years ago, organized in large part over viral WhatsApp groups, but there was like dozens of different groups. So how you would make sense of these is more difficult. And just generally, I would say, I don't know if this is a technical bottleneck or just a sort of a bottleneck in the scholarship, is there's a tendency, as I'm sure some of my other panelists are aware, to read too much into digital data and to not triangulate it with good qualitative research. And I think that there's a real danger in this, if not sort of really thinking through what we can take from the digital data. And there's oftentimes a reading off of whatever we get as reflective of maybe a broader constituency or broader processes. And I think that sometimes we just have to be a little bit more skeptical about what digital data can or cannot tell us. And that level of skepticism is, I think, oftentimes insufficient because it's new and exciting. So people kind of like look the other way, maybe. And I think as it becomes more normalized, hopefully there'll be some better best practices for thinking about how we're using the data, thinking about how we're presenting like the back end of how we read the data, right? Things like that.
Yes, thanks. Risto.
Yeah. So maybe my answer is a bit different than Eric's. I think historians, they don't at the moment read too much in the digital data sets. I think in general they don't use available data sets enough in historical research. It's almost like this, I think, at least in Finnish historical research. But Sami mentioned some bottlenecks there in his question. He mentioned lack of machine readable sources. He mentioned bad quality of digitalization projects, such as terrible OCR in some newspaper projects. And he mentioned also these lack of computational skills. So I would say all of these are problem but the biggest problem is that at least most historians, to me it seems, they do not know what is possible and what is not possible in the 2020s. So I think we should have better and more carefully thought research designs from the perspective of digital labor history. And in my eyes, research designs, it covers computational methods, it covers dissemination of results, it covers long-term storage of work that we have done. And in order to do this all more sensibly right now, I guess we need multidisciplinary projects, because historians at the moment do not have a good understanding of all these different areas. But of course, in the future, I want to see that our history students, for example, when they graduate, they have a good understanding on all these digital components of their research. But of course, this big ship, it turns, as we know, it turns very, very slowly. So this I see somewhere maybe in the 2030s or something like that.
Okay, thank you. Risto already touched the issue of students and how to educate them. So maybe also other speakers have some ideas of how should we best educate the next generation of students interested in the histories of social movements and so on. So do you have any ideas how should this be done? I myself have been teaching digital history courses which focus on resources and methods for the study of 19th and 20th century history, but this one course only offers a very short introduction to the many aspects of digital history, and it would be great to kind of create some advanced courses which could thematically focus on labor history, on social movements, for example. But maybe you have some ideas to this question of educating students. Anyone can start.
Well, I can say something. I don't know what is the state of the art of digital history in Sweden or America. Maybe my colleagues could say a word or two about this later. But in Finland, as Sami said already, in most universities we have like one introductory course to digital history. And in my opinion, at least, this is not enough, clearly not enough. For example, I'm now doing a research fellowship in Luxembourg in C2DH Research Center, and they start a full master's program in digital history. And in addition to this, later this year, they open 18 PhD positions in digital history. And we have one course in my alma mater, Tampere University. I think this has to change. So I would like, as I already perhaps implied before, that our students, they would have, when they graduate, they would have the basics of text mining. They would know what kind of data sets are available in Finland and in the world for the study of social movements. They would also know, like Eric hinted there, they would also know what kind of problems are related to these kind of new fancy data sets. And they would also know how to digitize their own historical sources in a sensible fashion. And they would know how to store these data sets that they have prepared for generations that come after them. But yeah, how to do this in practice, that I don't know. Maybe there has to be national coordination, at least in Finland, because the talent pool of digital history in Finland, it is, let's say, it's quite limited. It is unrealistic that each history department would have strong expertise in all fields of digital history. Yeah.
The only thing I would add is, in my experience teaching this, is I think it's just best to get students' hands dirty and give them like a small little project to try doing, even if it's just minimal, because there's a disconnect and there's a between learning the methods and then having a sense of how you might be able to do this. And there can be kind of a relatively steep learning curve for some of this, like topic modeling. In my experience, you have to learn R, there can be a lot. So doing like a really basic sentiment analysis or something like this, it could just be fun. And I think that gives people a sense of possibility, for my students at least. And then you can walk people through it. That's what I've taught. I've walked people through how I did my research. And if you start with an empirical puzzle you can solve, then I think it's more interesting. And it's not just sort of methods for the method's sake.
No, I think you're right there, Eric. Some sort of basic method knowledge is, of course, skills are necessary, but I also don't think that, I mean, if digital labor history is a method, I don't think the method should be driving the research. I think interesting research questions needs to drive the research, and then you learn the tools you need in order to answer these questions. And these questions needs to also have some sort of societal relevance. Otherwise, I think we will have problems getting funded in the future. So it's to me, and I come from a discipline that has been very sort of quantified. Most people do very advanced methodological statistical analysis that almost no one understands. And I think there's a danger in that, because then the societal relevance sort of gets lost. And then, you know, you have critics that start to question why should we fund this research at all. So I think you should start with an interesting theoretical or empirical problem, and then learn the method that you need in order to answer these questions, and not let the method drive with the research question. That's my experience from political science, is that we tend to let method drive research instead of the other way around.
Yes, thank you. Speaking of societal relevance, I have a quick question to Eric specifically, because you have not only studied teacher strikes, but you have also successfully organized them. How do you see this relation between research and activism in your own work? Does taking part in the strike movement make you see something in your data that wouldn't be visible otherwise to you as a researcher, and vice versa? Has this, your work on text mining, has it given you new insights into your labor activism? So
yeah, that's a good question. A few things. One is, I think, because I've always been more kind of a scholar activist, one of the benefits of that for the research is it's given me access to data that I wouldn't have had otherwise. Because, just to give an example, to be able to download these Facebook groups, you can't do that just online. Basically, each one of the admins of these groups had to trust me and give me access. And there's no way they would have done that had we had not really been working together for months. I helped organize national solidarity for the strikes. And it's very unlikely they would have given it to anybody else. They didn't give it to anybody else. So that's one thing, is having a foot in the door of the movements gives you access to different data. And then I think the main thing is just it being engaged in both worlds shapes the types of questions I ask. I think it goes to the thing that Jenny was asking. I don't personally see the point of doing research at this point that doesn't have some sort of social relevance, given the world we live in. It just feels, politically and morally questionable to not do something that will hopefully be of relevance to making the world somewhat better. And so I think that's actually quite important, because in labor studies and sociology today, there's a lot of stuff that I don't know, I'll put it this way, I feel like is somewhat outdated, that it reflects types of questions that don't speak to the urgency of the moment. So just trying to think through what researchers can do to bring to bear understandings that will be useful for actually understanding social movements is pretty important, because I would say, and this is the last thing, is there isn't as much rigorous reflection within social movements as there could be. And this is something that I think as social scientists or historians we could bring, is to try to push organizers who oftentimes, I say for good reason, sometimes want to believe what they want to believe. You know, there's we have the ability to kind of push back on and force people to ask questions in a way that isn't always convenient. And so I think it cuts both ways. If we're just being rah and romanticizing what's happening, we're not actually helping anybody do anything better.
Yes, thank you. Then I don't see any comments in the chat at this point. Now you can, it's the time to start to write comments or even raise hands if you want to ask something personally. But before that, I have one question on crowdsourcing. Do you see any possibilities for involving a large group of ordinary people to contribute to digital labor history or labor studies projects? As an example, I just would like to mention the ongoing project Finns in Russia 1917-1964, which is led by the National Archives of Finland. This project is it's very much related to labor history, because most of the Finns who moved to Soviet Karelia and elsewhere in the Soviet Union were workers, and this project has been quite successful in crowdsourcing, as over 300 volunteers have contributed to processing archival materials for the project, and they have used this Zooniverse platform, which is specifically designed for crowdsourced research. But do you have any other projects in mind or ideas about how could we use the power of the crowd in digital labor history research projects? I would say that labor history and labor studies should be in the forefront of this kind of people-powered research. Anyone?
Well, I would like to learn more about this. I don't know any good examples of crowdsourcing in the context of labor history, but if somebody in the panel or in the audience has some advice where I could read more, I would be very, very interested to learn.
Well, I think that the example that you're mentioning seems like a good idea, because then there is a cooperation with an institution then that can take care of the material afterwards. Because somehow that maybe you need some sort of cooperation with an institution. I mean, of course, it depends on if you could crowdfund a research project, then the output would obviously be articles or a book. And I guess that could be done. But maybe it's even more important with infrastructure projects where you digitize something and it's open for more people to use. But that requires some form of archive or library that can take care of the material afterwards. And that might be tricky, because it's always connected with some costs, of course, to run infrastructures. I mean, that's our experience of building this archive for the web pages of the trade unions and then leaving it to the archives to take care of it. So we also gave the archives a cost to run it.
Okay, Silke has something, some points about this.
And suddenly I'm on this panel. Can you hear me? Yeah. Okay. So what Jenny said, I think, is really important, because we are having lots of researchers who are now applying for money for this kind of infrastructure projects. But of course, it's really important that we can have a long-term preservation of this kind of material as well. And so I think what the archives need to do, and the different institutions, is develop a kind of standards, some kind of instructions, like a format that we could say, send it in like this and that, so we can make sure we can preserve it in the future. Because now we are getting very, very different formats, very, very different platforms. And I think that's something for all the archival institutions and libraries as well to discuss, actually, to find solutions, because it's really difficult if the material is too on many different platforms, because it costs so much to preserve it in the long run. So I think this is something where scholars and institutions need to talk to each other about.
I would just add one thing, is that it would be really helpful if labor union and researchers and institutions in Scandinavian countries, Nordic countries, and Eastern Europe, which are much better than in the United States. This is like the most dramatic thing I see as far as the level of digitization of historical sources. Because I did look at, it was really helpful for me, for instance, when I was doing my research on the former Russian borderlands, that so much of this stuff is online. It's just amazing. It saved a lot of time and money. I wouldn't have been able to do it to the same extent otherwise. But there's no equivalent of that in the United States. It's much more underdeveloped. Like, most of the labor movement's archives are just not accessible at all. Most of the newspapers haven't been digitized. So if any of you have connections or pressure and can work with similar institutions in the United States, or try to encourage them, that would be really helpful, because it's way more underdeveloped here.
Maybe, Silke has a comment. Your hands. Can I perhaps continue from Silke's comment?
Yeah, and then I can come back.
Okay. The problem you mentioned, we have exactly the same problem in Finland, as you perhaps guessed already. So we have a lot of good researchers and research groups that have built very interesting data sets, but of course the standards are lacking. So we definitely need some national coordination. And luckily at the moment we have a big research infrastructure project in humanities and in social sciences funded by the Finnish Academia, in which we try to build these kind of standards and long-term storage for heterogeneous data sets in Finland. So.
Yeah, and just to say, Eric, about your collaboration, there is of course a collaboration between labor history institutes all over the world in the International Association of Labor History Institutes, and there is a huge debate about digitization of the material and the long-term preservation of digital porn material as well. So I think it will this will take place in the US as well, but of course our labor history institutes here in the Nordic countries, they are the oldest in the world, and with really well preserved collections in most cases, especially when it comes to Sweden, of course. But I think there's an international debate going on this, but that doesn't bring the resources and the money you need to do it. That's the problem.
Yes, thank you. Still, I don't see any questions in the chat, so I have one more question about the risks of the digital turn. Does this so-called digital turn make us study certain types of research questions? I mean that, do we let the material and the methods decide what we study? And I would say that this risk is certainly real, but what's the best way to manage it? For example, it seems that everyone is working on digitized newspaper materials currently, and there is also a growing body of scholarship on digitized working on digitized parliamentary papers, but does this interest in certain type of materials have some negative consequences for research? So maybe you have some ideas on this based on your own research, not only limited to historical research.
I can start maybe. So I guess, yeah, it sounds like a bit loaded question, Sami. Maybe you know the situation better because you teach more. If I remember correctly, you have said that students nowadays, they like to use these digital sources more and more in their research because they are so easy to use. But I think if we think about doctoral dissertations and bigger research projects, then perhaps I would like to remind the critics of digital history that it's not inevitable that a digital history should lead to a more limited range of sources used in historical research. Because to these big national memory organizations, for example, it seems to me that it is actually possible to to cooperate with them. I mean, it's possible to affect their decision making. So Sami, I think instead of whining in the coffee room, maybe it's time that we historians we use our power and we take more actively part in the digitalization processes of original sources by putting pressure on the national key players, but also by digitalizing ourselves. It's not impossible.
Okay, should I continue? I think, of course, there is a risk, and it's also part of the logic in academia. We need to publish all the time. And then, of course, if you have a material which is easy to access, that or a data set or something, it might be easy to just think, can I make something more out of this material? It might not be such an interesting research question, but at least it's one more publication. And I think this could become a dilemma, that when we see articles that are only based on digitized newspapers, and after a while it's going to get diluted what sort of research questions you can answer with this material. Of course, there is a risk, but I think we need to sort of remind ourselves that we need to pose interesting research questions that have societal relevance. So I come back to that point that I had before.
The only thing I would add, I agree with all that, is it would be really helpful if it's a specific thing. I would love it if there was more digitization of minutes and sort of internal deliberations. Newspapers are easier, and I think it just has to do with the form and the preservation. But if the types of questions we ask really can expand a lot more when we get the kind of deliberative body, and a lot of the stuff exists. It just hasn't been, for whatever reason, digitized as much, and I think that would be really helpful. So insofar as that can be made available, it will allow for us to not assume that the public, newspapers have their own form, they have their own iterations. You can't, and this gives us, I think, maybe a richer sense of what is going on behind the scenes and some of the tensions that tend to be papered over in newspapers.
Yes, Silke, you have something to add, please.
It's funny, I've become the only participant who is active here because of the direct access. No, but I think, Eric, you're right about that minutes would be really important. But of course, there is this whole protection of individuals there that we need to take care of. So it's a very difficult material to digitize, and many organizations are not willing to digitize it. And also, if you think about, what would be the most strategic things to digitize? If we think about, we have to choose one or two things because it's so expensive to do it. So at our institute, we have decided to digitize the annual reports of trade unions. from the local level to the international level. From the beginning and hopefully until 2020, we're not sure we'll get through this, because we think you get a short overview over what a union has done over the year, because there are so many things. We have like 7 kilometers of trade union material at our archives. So it's lots of material that has never been used because people don't know that trade unions have been dealing with this and that. And so for that reason, annual reports, they are short, they're standardized, and they give an entrance to something else. So I think that might be something that would work if we think about an organizational approach to digitize material.
Yes, thank you. Now, I suppose it would be a good time for other participants as well to ask or comment on any of these issues that have been discussed. And yeah, maybe some of you also have some interesting projects underway or under planning that would be related to labor history or labor studies, and you would like to kind of discuss some issues related to them.
So you have either to raise your hand if you're in the audience, or you can write in the chat.
Okay, Philip, you have some point, and maybe you want to ask it yourself. Do I need to do something?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
But you cannot see me, right?
Yes.
Okay. Well. Well, first of all, thank you to all the speakers, and I just wanted to support Eric's comment on the material that is or is not digitized at the moment, because on the one hand, I really appreciate that there are so many trade union papers now that are digital, and also, you know, all the social democratic and socialist dailies that we now have in digital form, but they tend to reproduce the voice of trade union functionaries and party leaderships. So it is, I think, an increasing problem that we lack minutes, for instance, because they would give us also the perspective of, you know, rank and file positions, and we still lack that. And the more, you know, we have access to digitized newspapers, the bigger this bias becomes, I think.
Yes. Thanks. Does anyone want to comment on that?
Yeah, maybe I could just say that I have the same problem in my dissertation, but of course the context was very different, the turn of the 20th century. So I used then printed labor newspapers, but in addition, I had to go to the archives and find them handwritten newspapers, which is closer to the rank and file, closer to the grassroots of labor movement. So, but I don't know, yeah, in the 21st century, what would be the handwritten newspapers of the 21st century? Maybe it's some kind of online content, what Eric has been studying, that gives us those insights.
Well, we have a quiet audience there. Maybe, yeah, you didn't, the speakers, okay, Kalle has something about the GDPR and personal data protection laws and the problems caused by them to labor history research. Yeah. What's your view on this? Jenny?
Yeah, I feel I should start because we had major problems with the GDPR when we were building this archive. GDPR didn't exist when we started the project. So we started out thinking we would collect Facebook conversations and sort of group discussions, that kind of material that Eric has used. And then GDPR came and we had to reconsider everything. It turned out to be very, very tricky to, we couldn't do what we wanted to do. What we did now was that we asked the trade unions to download their Facebook feeds and Twitter feeds, and then send, because if you own the account, you can download the history and then send the files to us, and we then added it to the e-archive, but it's in a separate interface. So in order to access this material, you need to be a researcher and you need to have a research plan which has been gone through ethical vetting in order to access it. So it did not turn out the way we imagined, that, you know, an old trade union person could go into the archive and just have a look at what did we write on Facebook 2014. That did not work out the way we thought it would. So GDPR is a problem, really problem.
Sorry, Silke, you can continue.
Yeah, and it's I think it's a very good question, Kalle, because it's also a problem for the unions at the moment, because when they are getting advice about how to handle their archives, and they have a specific person who is in charge of this GDPR issues, they think that they need to throw away, you know, membership lists and so on and so on. And I mean, that's not the case. But it's of course a difficult issue how to handle this digitized material. So for instance, in this project we have with the digitalization of annual reports, we make sure that, I mean, if you're an elected president of a trade union, you're a public person, and that's not a problem. But of course, there can always be issues, especially when it comes to local trade union activism, where you would see some people acting and you wouldn't want to make this public. So we are actually blinding out the names for the last, I think, 50 years or something in that project. But I think that's one issue that can be solved technically. But what is really difficult, this is the unions not saving this kind of material and throwing it away. So I think there is no really good solution at the moment for archives like ours, but the discussions are ongoing with, amongst others, the national archives in Sweden to say this is not working for us in this way. Yeah, I don't know if this was a really good answer, but I think it's a real problem in the unions at the moment, and the idea of GDPR that we can't mention any names anywhere anymore.
Yes, thank you for these points. These issues, also issues of copyright, related to copyright, they definitely seem to be an issue. As I've mostly studied history that is older than 100 years, the problems are much less stressing in this respect as for many of you probably. Yeah, maybe, I have one question about maybe to all of you in the audience and speakers outside Finland. Are you aware of any projects utilizing handwritten text recognition technology related to the study of labor history or social movements, because I've been working now with handwritten materials and using transcripts for transcribing them automatically. I've worked mostly on petitions, mainly written by workers in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, and just to kind of, I don't know yet exactly what I'm going to do with this material, but I would hope that there would be some possibilities also for international comparison and things like that. So I don't know if you have some knowledge of this kind of research done in other countries. Silke, do you have?
Yeah, our project on the digitization of annual reports includes handwritten text recognition. And the problem is, if you look at local unions, normally you have one person who writes, and for transcribers you need maybe 100 pages to recognize this specific handwriting. But we're working with the IT department at Uppsala University, and they're working on a HTR that is focusing on the letters. So you don't recognize the entire word, but the letters, and that enables you also, you don't need as much written material as transcribers, and it helps you, for instance, if you have local expressions and dialectical expressions, or you would have, say, it's not always, correctly spelled and so on. And this new method might help. It will be developed together with our work of this project, because the IT department needs lots of material to develop the program. So the idea is to develop it like this, and hopefully this will help that you will find like generations of people who write in a similar way, the way you learned it in school, and it will help, if it's developed, it will help to recognize even other material. So this is what is going on at the moment. I don't know how fast it will work. It will be a kind of combination of using transcribers and this development of this, because it's so much material. But for local material, and sometimes you only have 2 pages or something of one person, that would be a really, really good solution. And I think our colleagues in Belgium, they are also working on a similar method together with the University of Ghent about this. So I can put you in touch with people there if you're.
Sounds good. Risto, you have something to say?
No, nothing very, very important, but I just want to mention that, of course, one solution to your problem of handwriting will perhaps be in the near future, when there will be language model that understand noisy data sets. For example, in Finland, we have this research group, Turku NLP, who is right now developing a language model that would understand historical noisy Finnish. So then, even if you have not perfect handwriting model, then this language model could perhaps understand the words in it.
Oh, sounds good, because, well, I would imagine you could then use transcripts for transcribing the materials, and then as it contains a lot of imperfect language, then you could use these tools to kind of make it, to lemmatize it and so on. So it sounds it could work. Okay, I'm running out of questions, but maybe you speakers or someone in the audience have something to add.
well, should we, since we have a lot of time, maybe we could also talk a little bit about methods. Like I'm thinking about Eric's research here, for example, like sometimes it has been mentioned that these available methods, they affect how we study labor history or labor studies at the moment. So Eric, I would like to ask you perhaps, why did you choose topic mining in particular for your research problem? Because yeah, some maybe people might say that, okay, these historians, they use topic modeling because they don't know any other options, but how would you silence this kind of criticism? Like,
yeah, that's a good question. Well, I think this goes to what Jenny said. I think the starting point is you need to find a puzzle in the world and then figure out the method that's going to be best used for that. So for me, the puzzle was why did workers think they won when they won less than in one strike as the other? So this was the thing. And then in order to do that, I needed a method that was, put it this way, I needed the best approximation to tracking different subjects of discussion without me having to arbitrarily from the beginning determine what these were. And so what's nice about topic modeling is it's in theory, and it can be, depending on how you do it, it can be, you find latent topics, which is to say that it's a statistical algorithm that allows for researchers to discover potentially what is being discussed without you having to have priors about what you think they might be discussing. So for me, that was why topic modeling per se, as opposed to like a keyword search in which you already have to, in your head, know what you're looking for. Topic modeling, that's not quite the case. You just put in, there's different parameters, and so there is space to kind of like mess around with it, and there's some ambiguity here, but you basically just put in the number of topics you're looking for and a few other sort of statistical parameters, and then you get an output, and then you have to read that output. So for me, that was helpful because it didn't bias me to assume that there were certain things that were important to the participants in the strike. And I think it allowed me to then look at what was going on and to base my conclusions off of that, as opposed to just finding what I was looking for, and which I think is what methods wise is a good thing to shoot for. And then the difficulty with a lot of this, with a lot of methods is, I mean, it's not specific to digital, is that you find what you're looking for. And so one of the nice things about topic modeling is I think ideally it cuts against the grain on that a bit if you do it right.
Thanks, good answer.
Maybe you have something to say up, all of you. What are you doing next with digital methods? Some kind of next step, what you are kind of hoping to be able to do in the near future?
Yeah, there are so many ideas. I don't know. Lifespan is very limited. So what should I do next? I'm seriously struggling with this question right now. But of course, you mentioned the parliamentary data set that is coming out later this year. It contains all the Finnish parliamentary debates from the beginning until today. So I don't know. I think it's so tempting to go into that direction. But of course, there's a lot of competition in that area. But yeah, I would like to study, now that I have studied socialist newspapers, I would also like to include them parliamentary debates in my research, in my postdoc show one day. But I want to find them grassroots actors as well. Like, how would I find them in the archives? I don't know. I don't have a solution for this yet. maybe studying like city councils and village councils, like if their debates have been archived, recorded somehow, maybe if I could include them, it would be at least one step closer to the everyday life. And in terms of methods, I've been studying text network analysis recently, like how to visualize text with Python and Gephi, for example.
Eric, you have some.
Yeah, well, two things. One is my next book is more looking at how digital tools are being used in current labor mobilizations, and so it's unclear to me yet exactly how much the digital data per se will be useful for that. That remains to be seen. But I do have in my head a big project which maybe some of us can work on at some point. I think it's like feasible now through digital methods to do like a big comparative international comparisons between the trajectories of labor movements. And so I thought it'd be really interesting to think about, do a comparison of the US and Sweden, for instance, as like the historically strongest and weakest labor movements in the advanced capitalist world, to try to understand the extent to which, for instance, different politics correlates with union densities, or there's all sorts of really interesting big meta questions you could ask about the trajectories of labor movements over big spans of time, and we start to have enough data for that. So to me, that would be like a very ambitious big project that would require a lot of people working on, but I think that is something that we should aspire to.
Okay, I think that sounds really interesting. So where am my research going? I'm not completely sure. Am I doing digital labor history? Well, you mentioned the parliamentary debates, and actually Silke and I have a project together where I am actually analyzing parliamentary debates from the Indian parliament on how they discussed minimum wages over time. And this is really, I think the Indian labor movement has, or academics have managed to really digitize the sources and put them online, available for anyone to download. I mean, I'm amazed with what we can find online from India, which is good because during COVID, it hasn't been possible to go there and dig in the archives. So I guess this is my next move here.
Yes, thank you. This what Eric said about and Jenny also about this kind of possible comparative projects is brought to my mind there. But Silke and others, you've been thinking about this kind of online dictionary of the labor activists, of Nordic labor activists, or something like that, and start maybe how could we kind of use the digital methods there in the creation of this kind of dictionary? Maybe I'm not so aware of this discussion, but maybe Silke, you have something to say about this.
I think now my colleague Jonas had to leave earlier. He's working on this at the moment because I think what it will enable us to is doing the kind of network studies of the Nordic labor movement and their international connections. So I think we need to make a difference between the kind of creating an infrastructure through digital materials, digital born or digitized, and then the methods of doing digital history and the analysis. And I think in this project we do on the annual reports, we do have linguists and people who do this kind of topic modeling and so on, who do part of this to make the material more available. But I think that will be very different. I think what's important with this making material digitally available is that it can be used for a number of different studies. And I think that's the problem if we get this kind of ideas from people who say, okay, I need to digitize this for my research, and you can have this material later on, which is nice for the archives in one way, but sometimes it's curated in a way that makes it only usable for a few studies. And I think that's the challenge. And I think that's where we need to think broader. And that's the idea with the dictionary, saying, we collect all the biographies of people who have been active in the labor movement organizations in the Nordic countries, could be local, could be national, and you can add to it. It's not like a book that is finished, but we can add to it and it can be accessed from outside. I think that's something that will be very useful, not only to researchers, but also to the labor movement. And I think that's the other part of it. I think like Jenny's project on the Facebook pages and so on, that's something that's also really useful for the labor movement to go back to and see, how was the discussion at that time? That's the way how they use annual reports as well. That's the everyday use of labor history in unions, actually, just to see, okay, when did we make this and that decision? And I think we need to think a bit more in this direction, and that we can combine, the important questions, but not only the important questions of today, but also of the future and of the past, by thinking broader when digitizing. So I think we will discuss this dictionary at the next Nordic Labour History Network meeting. And we are trying to write an application to make this possible on a Nordic basis. And then, of course, we need to talk about language as well. Because there's also an advantage of digitized material and the way how it can be translated easier and so on.
Thank you. Now, anyone wants to have the last word or last question? Never.
I just want to say a big thank you to all of you for organizing this. And there will be more seminars in the coming weeks. And the next time, hopefully, the links will be easily available differently from this time. Really apologies for this. But thanks a lot. It's been a very interesting panel.
Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks all.
See you somewhere at some point. Yes.
Yeah.